To all those who are watching, welcome. Our session today will be on bridging place and policy in divisive times. And our presenter today is Ashley Whedon. She is a rural futurist currently working as a PhD candidate, researcher, and sessional lecturer at the University of Guelph, and a visiting researcher at Scotland's Royal College in Edinburgh, supported by a Rural Policy Learning Commons Research and Exchange Mobility Grant. Her research is focused on place-based innovation and rural policy foresight, future-oriented community capacity building, knowledge mobilization, and public policy renewal. So now I'm going to pass it on to Ashley.
Fantastic. Thanks for the great introduction, Manzaline, and thank you to the folks that I see that have joined us on the list. There's a couple familiar names there and a few that I don't know, so that's fantastic. That means we got a good group that I can ask a whole lot of questions to, because I'm going to preface this with saying my questions about place and policy and what they mean in times that feel increasingly polarized are far more than any ideas that I might have about potential ways forward. And it's something that I've been wrestling with over the last few months in some of my work. So I hope that we get to have a great conversation as part of this webinar around how we might approach place with accountability and with responsibility and with meaning, and in ways that don't send us down a path for potentially more problems than maybe we bargained for. So I think it's a really good opportunity to sit and interrogate these ideas around what we mean by place, and how this might offer us a way into looking at division from a different way, as well as a word of caution around how we might leverage place in a policy context, particularly in rural contexts, in ways that don't set us up for pitting place against place, or creating opportunities for exclusion as a result of that. So I'm going to pull up my deck here and share that, and start from the top. So Manzaline gave you a great introduction as to what I'm working on and who I am and where I come from. For those that aren't intimately connected with the work that I've done or haven't worked with before, I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Guelph, working in local government for most of the last decade, primarily on future-oriented community economic development projects. And didn't really know about place-based things until I got back into the PhD side of things and came back to academia, and went, oh, well, there's a whole name for stuff that we were doing maybe rather intuitively without calling it that. I also am lucky to be supported by the Rural Policy Learning Commons this fall to be at Scotland's Royal College, where I'm digging into a lot of the great place-based approaches that are happening here in Scotland. And right now I'm actually coming to you live from Orkney, where I'm doing a little bit of context setting on some of the things that are happening here as well, and visiting with some colleagues from the University of Highlands and Islands. So I've been quite fortunate to get to experience a lot of really interesting and special places this fall, as well as previously in my career. Increasing these experiences that are driven by getting to see and be part of and become embedded in different places have brought me these questions around if we all feel that we're special and unique, but we all face similar challenges around depopulation or around economic change, we're all struggling to deal with what an uncertain future around climate change might look like for rural, remote, and particularly island communities as well. We need to be very careful about the way we bridge place into policy, and how we introduce tools that are able to be nuanced but are not so specific that they become almost more to the needs and desires of the people that live in a place, as well as being aware of what the limitations of policy are in terms of being a rather blunt instrument for dealing with things that will be felt quite specifically in terms of the people that live, work, and shape any given place. So you can find me, and I hope that you find me and follow me and continue this conversation as we go, either on Twitter or by email, or any number of ways. I'm highly findable, so if you look for my name online, you'll be able to get in touch with me some way, and I hope that you do either during this webinar or later on to continue this conversation. when we talk about divisive times and what place has to do with that, we're really running into what in the last couple of years have been called the geography of discontent, and this, you know, the rise, as it will, of the places that have been left behind. And there's even been some interesting work, and I've included a list of references at the end of this deck that provides some further reading for those that are interested on it or who aren't familiar, but I imagine most folks that are on this call are, around the revenge of the places that don't matter. It's a phrase I'm not sure I quite like, but I think it is quite provocative in thinking about where things like Brexit, or now following the last election in Canada, the idea of a Wexit, sort of Western alienation, made into this idea of seceding from the Federation. We have these notions of building a wall, and the election of Donald Trump to office in the United States, and the division that has come with that. And largely, the popular narrative and the public narrative around this seems to be focused on this being a backlash from rural, or from regions whose economies have changed and have not found a replacement for the removal of primary industry or extraction, or from places that simply feel distrustful and not represented in the larger institutions that are meant to represent them. Whether that is factual or not is maybe sort of beside the point, because I think that the stories we tell ourselves about place matter almost as much as the statistics that we can find about those places. And I say that maybe not lightly, in that we need all those great stats, and knowing that Ray Bowman is on the call, that I would never turn down the legitimacy of that. But the narratives that we talk about when it comes to places left behind, or revenge of those places, or even the geography of discontent, have power in defining what those mean. These are also, to me, seem to be symptoms of conflict in place-based identities. So when we look at things like the leave or remain question here in the United Kingdom, where I currently am based, or if we look at Western alienation in Canada, it really comes down to this conflict between my identity to this particular place is different than the way that I feel an identity or a tie to a larger framework, whether that's national or supranational in the case of the EU. And then it also has this idea around two people occupying the same space having a different idea of their place-based identities. And we're seeing that come out in this, the ongoing tensions of will they, won't they actually leave when it comes to Brexit, or how do you negotiate the idea that I might very strongly believe that Western Canada has a particular orientation, just in, for example, whereas my neighbor might feel something entirely different. And so we're wrestling now with what feels like a louder and louder volume around this conflict and a fracturing of place-based identities that are coming about at a rapid pace. And I think that often when we focus on those things, it becomes one person is right and one person is wrong, rather than a really important discussion around who decides who gets to belong, who decides which place-based identity or which place-based history or place-based goal or aspiration is the one that wins, for lack of a better term, is the one that takes primacy, when we know that there are no right answers. There really isn't a right answer when it comes to the policy intervention or the future here. There are multiple possible futures, and any way you look at it, you can poke at it and something else will come out. But the real question around this seems to me to be about who decides who gets to belong, what's in and what's out, and how do we determine the identity and the experience of a place. And these divisions feel more and more like the surfacing of those tensions as places become more complex, as the world becomes more interconnected and seems to feel more complex. The struggle to adapt to that complexity is surfacing. The challenges that come with those changes in place-based identity. However, despite all that doom and gloom and that conflict and challenge, we do have a number of surveys and of data that's come out of other projects that emphasizes that, at least in Canada, we feel that we have the shared values and a belief in the Federation that will help us overcome these divisions. And so it's an interesting thing to say that in one level we can feel that this is something we can surmount, while in another level, particularly through political expression, we're seeing something entirely different. So this question of what story we're telling and how we're reinforcing that is a really interesting one to dig into when we think about the progressive nature of place, and place being a dynamic thing that's always being negotiated as a process. And if we look at it that way, this really recalls some of Doreen Massey's excellent work around progressive sense of place that came out in 1991, that offers us this kernel of hope that if a place is always in progress, then it can be oriented towards overcoming that division, or we can head in a direction that allows us to find where we link up in the process, versus if we view place as static or something that is predetermined, then our options for overcoming that division feel much more limited. So does place actually give us a window into addressing this division? And I kind of hint at my thoughts earlier around this kernel of hope that place offers us for thinking about it as dynamic and in process and in progress and always developing and being something that's negotiated. On the flip side, we have this really big challenge that if we get too deeply embedded in divisions and in terms of determining, drawing lines around a place rather than keeping a rather fuzzy notion of what it means to be place-based or what place means, that we really do run this risk. We head down that slippery slope around authenticity and who's in and who's out, and what the true voice of a place is. And I don't need to go much further down that line of argument before you can really see the danger in that, and historically the ways in which that's been used to catastrophic ends for people. So to take this back a step further, after I've kind of introduced what has sort of been jumbling around in my mind as a lot of really complicated ideas around how we use place for good, I think it's really important to take a step back. And I positioned this webinar as looking at Doreen Massey's work, mostly because I'm quite curious about what feels to me like a seminal piece of work, and that offers us a lot of contemporary insight and contextual work that can be used and is just as relevant now as it was when it was published in 1991. However, it also offers this interesting bit of maybe cynicism or depression or something sad that we haven't seemingly been able to motivate over the last almost 20 years, this concept of a progressive sense of place into practice, into actual policy. And here's where I would say that so much of what we do when we talk about place-based rural policy is actually just geographic policy. It's spatial policy, where we draw a border around a particular region on the map, and then we often an external body will say, this is what we think will happen here, and this is what we think should happen here, and then that's the direction things are meant to go, rather than something feeling a little bit more messy and complex and coming from an endogenous place that encapsulates more than just the spatial side of things, but all of the dynamic bits that go into that. So this is how I've tended to conceptualize Doreen Massey's work when she talks about sort of these four particular aspects of place, in that we have to be careful not to frame places as being static or frozen in time. Just as capital is not a thing, but a process, so too are places, as she says in that piece. So we have to be careful not to reduce the great complexity of places and their stories embedded in them into purely quantitative data. Instead, we have to think about, when we look at rural places in particular, that we might say, for example, data on the islands and island here in Scotland saying that there needs to be, I believe it was a net migration of about 76,000 people over the next 10 years. What's embedded in that number? That's a huge number. And is that possible? Is that plausible? Is that actually desirable? And so we have to think about what hides in those numbers, what's not being said in those numbers, when we know in some communities that the migration of 2 or 3 people that are deeply engaged and embedded in that community and in that place will have a much bigger impact than 200 that might arrive without that same sort of networked approach to things. So we have to be very, very careful about what we're using to frame places and how we're looking at those things, and in terms of quantitative and qualitative data in order to tell a better story. Secondly, places don't actually have simple boundaries. While they might be necessary for us in government or in research in terms of being able to know where to apply a particular program or policy, they're not actually a precondition to understanding place. So rather being defined purely in relation to the outside, which is so often the case for rural communities, being defined in opposition to the urban, places can and really should be defined through their linkages to each other. And here I'm sitting here talking to you from Orkney around the feelings that when you talk to people here, talking to, just even briefly to folks, that on a map or in a context from someone from the outside, it feels and looks remote. That's not the feeling that people that live here have. They feel well connected, they feel well networked, and they feel embedded in the sense of place as well as connected to other places. So it would be very easy to draw a line around this and say, well, because it's separated by water, it's remote or it's isolated. When in fact, if you look at the interlinkages between ferry transport or between communities, or even globally through broadband, this is not a place that feels isolated. So moving beyond sort of rather arbitrary spatial definitions of place might help us to address some of the divisiveness that we talked about earlier, by reconsidering or at least acknowledging the kind of ahistorical drawing of borders that ignores the context of the history that is placed on top of. This is something that's not easy from the research side. You do have to be able to draw some sort of line around something if you want to take a look at it. But we have to find a way to not reduce places to just their spatial properties, but work towards what I believe Zita Cobb said at SURF this fall, a globalized network of highly localized places. Third, places don't have single and unique identities. They have these layers of internal conflicts, conflicts over the past, conflicts over the present, conflicts over the future. And maybe some of the symptoms that we're seeing around these divisions is a result of having downplayed these conflicts and these layers and layers of conflicts over the past however long the place has existed. So these conflicts and these layered identities have to be something that we think about when we're developing future-oriented rural policy. The notion that our place identities as individuals shift and change depending on where we are in the world. An example that I've recently shared with folks is that when I'm abroad, when I'm here in Scotland, and someone asks me where I'm from, I would say simply that I'm Canadian. However, if I'm at home, depending on where I am again, I might tell you that I'm from Bruce County, or I might tell you that I'm from, the 6th line and the 12th concession in Centre Wellington. It depends on the context and the person that I'm speaking to. And so in that way, my place identity is both transitive and transformative. And physical places, the spatial element of those places share that depending on who you're speaking to and what you're asking them. An individual's relationship to place will change, and their identity as tied to that will change as well. And lastly, the fourth thing that comes through from Doreen's work is this idea that when we put these challenges together, we have these very, very specific contexts that are always kind of evolving. And a big challenge in the policy side of things is being able to recognize the life cycle of places, or being able to respond to that change in terms of wrestling with this overlay of what I've drawn here this spatial realities interacting and conflicting identities and the wider networks that connect people in place. As we dig more and more into place-based approaches, we have to find ways to deal with things that are both sometimes accidents of history, sometimes they're stories passed down over generations. Sometimes it's simply a case of a thing that's always been assumed to be true from the outside, but doesn't feel that way from the inside. We have to find ways in policy to be able to respond to these things. This might be the most powerful leverage point, as far as I'm concerned, in developing a policy that is able to evolve with a place rather than look at the past and try to maintain and conserve that. Just yesterday, speaking with some folks out of Inverness, there was a fantastic example shared with me, and just a great phrase that as we look at place-based approaches, we are at risk of creating heritage center after heritage center in the place schools. And so there are no young people and no future anymore. There's just a lot of museums for the past. And it was something that I thought was such an important indicator of the way we look at rural development and place-based approaches, where we think about conserving something that already exists or paying attention to heritage, sometimes at the expense of what our future might look like. So what that boils down to is the idea that place is somewhere in particular, but it really depends on who you ask, when you ask them, and what you do with what you hear. And the challenge for policymakers and researchers is to find some way to deal with what we hear, what we listen to, and to be very transparent about the process of doing that. Unfortunately, I think in a lot of future scenarios plannings, when it comes to rural development or any sort of development, it's been co-opted a bit by processes that tend to black box this idea around how we decided what place is. So you might come to a table and talk with a policymaker, a business owner, a farmer, and a municipal politician, and find that everybody thinks that they understand what they mean by a place-based approach. But when you dig into it, they all have different ideas of what that place is, or what the boundary around that place is, or what's involved in developing those things. So I think that the best place-based policy is very clear and specific about how it was determined that this was the scale, this was the model, and this was the approach, and what was in and what was out, and why those decisions were made. So as we bridge place and policy, the struggles that seem to be forefront for me is this idea around wrestling with something that is both spatial and relational, and full of stories and conflict and complexity, and very specific and nuanced, with approaches that are often geared towards something that's missing. And so when we look at a lot of the territorial approaches or place-based approaches that are coming out of things like smart specialization or throughout Europe as a means of addressing lagging regions, and particularly those are most often Europe and most often rural contexts, they're all about fixing a place or making a place something different than what it is due to something that's lacking, rather than addressing those stories and conflict and complexity and the things that are embedded in that are also assets. So policy is actually intended to smooth that complexity. By its overall purpose, policy work is designed for everything. It's a generalist approach. So what do we lose in that translation of trying to take something that is very specific and nuanced and full of conflict and interesting tidbits that sometimes don't translate all that well outside of that context into a policy format where the very nature of the tool may not suit? And where are the places that are between these for finding a connection, for addressing that bit of work that gets lost in the translation? The way that I look at this and the way that I'm trying to wrestle with this as we go forward, and I'm really curious to hear what folks have to say in the conversation, whether through the chat box or later, is that more frequently and maybe perhaps to more depth, we need to be looking at notions of power and process and how that's embedded in place-based policy. So questions and important decisions around the appropriate scale for decision making need to be done policy by policy. I think it's entirely too it's naive to think that place-based policy works for everything. And there are lots of scales where a national or an international or supranational scale actually works better for dealing with particular issues. And here we look at things around infrastructure. We look at questions that need to be addressed around climate change. We look at questions that need to be addressed around how we're going to negotiate particular relationships in a changing geopolitical climate. There are lots of questions there that can't really be negotiated place by place, but there are lots of things that can be and maybe should be devolved to the place level if we're sure about understanding where the power and the decision making rests in terms of understanding what works best for a place. This idea of moving to cohesion beyond borders is a big part of that, around being able to find ways to connect these highly localized places to global networks in ways that are meaningful. So beyond just a productivist notion of that, of finding reasons to say we need to build broadband because it's an economic imperative, but to say, well, we need to connect these communities because it's a social and a cultural imperative as well. So moving beyond this idea of trade is the only impetus for connecting place to place. The idea around moving from fragility to green shoots is something that I find quite interesting, and this stems from some of the conversations that I've been fortunate enough to hear and learn from here in Scotland around moving away from indicating certain communities as being on a fragility index or being most at risk given the current climate, to something around green shoots. And so trying to leverage these stories of things that are working well, of young people that are wanting to stay in their communities, of things that are making the turn, so that we're not constantly reinforcing this idea that something is broken, but that we can introduce more complexity into the discussion so that we don't snuff out those green shoots before they get a chance to really see if they can grow into something. A lot of this is really based on a frustration, I think, with a need often for rural communities to make a really strong case as to why they need resources and investments because things are so bad, or to make a case for making the sell that we're a great place to come and live, to please come and build your life here, or come and visit us and develop our tourism industry because it's wonderful and you'll love it so much. And when in fact reality falls somewhere in the middle. It's not neither all disaster or all wonderful. There's something in the interplay between the two, and that it can be yes and. You can have things that are precarious and difficult and challenging and perhaps not working anymore at the same time that you're having new things take root and grow and provide opportunities for moving forward. So if we're really going to get serious about place-based policy, we need to find a way to introduce more complexity that's based on building things forward rather than on just filling holes in the stucco. The next thing is this idea around connecting policy to lived experience. This is a tricky one from both the research side and from the policy side, because if the aim of place-based policy is truly to trust communities or places or regions, however you want to define place, that they know what's right for their own futures, we need to be able to wrestle with difficult conversations when sometimes those choices seem maladaptive. And in these cases, I'm thinking of the difficult conversations that need to be had around energy policy, around our reliance on fossil fuels, and around how an industry that is seen as and felt as often as being a major employer, being a right to a livelihood, of being something that is important to your, not only just your economic baseline, but to your identity, but also wrestling with the fact that it has an impact on the wider global place. And if we continue down that road, this will not only be bad for the world writ large, it will continue to be bad for the place writ small. And so how do we find these negotiations between something that is a level of trust that place a place knows what's best for it and how best to thrive and succeed, with making sure that those decisions are based on good evidence, that those decisions are based on a full understanding of what's right for our futures, is decided by a breadth of people from within that place. This is a really complicated spot, and if you have thoughts and ideas around how to do that, I would love to talk to you, because I think that as we try to negotiate an uncertain future in a number of ways, this is something that's going to become increasingly tricky. The idea of desiring local, if not entirely at the local, then definitely at the regional level, with those broader national or supranational policies that we talked about earlier, sometimes being the most appropriate instrument for dealing with a particular thing. Understanding where that falls in the process and having those negotiated conversations can slide really quickly into a paternalistic approach to things, around we'll let a place play at a particular kind of development on their own, or at a particular kind of response to an issue, but not on something that we consider too important to be devolved to that level. So we need to be very, very careful around what this means when we're talking again about the appropriate scale and how that's connected to lived experience and what that sense of connection looks like. And finally, I say process because it's always about the process, at least in my mind, is that place is in process, policy is a process, and that all of these things have a continuing cycle to them, or have an evolution to them. And so it's not just about ensuring that there's appropriate engagement in the development of a public policy, but that continues to happen over time, and that we negotiate this as things change, as a community change. This is where those difficult conversations around whether all places will, should, or can make it need to be had. These are not palatable discussions at the political level, certainly not at the funding level for research, but there are important questions to be asked there around how we're attaching our energy to rural development for all places, and what that means. And there's two sides of these conversations to me, and one is one that's I look forward to an excellent collection coming out from Karen Foster and Jennifer Jarman around the right to be rural. And if it is about rights, then these places have a right to exist, whether or not there is an economic remit for them, or we believe that it's worth the return on investment to continue for them to exist. If it is about this idea of a right to be rural, of a right to be in that place. On the other side, how do we negotiate that then with what makes rational and reasonable sense from the policy side of things, in terms of, should we be keeping a water treatment facility running every 15 miles for every rural community that continues, or every rural place that continues to exist? And how do you rationalize if you lose a school, or you lose that water treatment facility, or you lose some other piece of civic infrastructure or an employer, that maybe the life cycle for a particular place has come to an end? And how do we look at death with dignity for some of those places? I heard a counter to that, which was rebirth with rights, from someone here. And I thought that was a really interesting way to look at things as well. But there is an important conversation that I think is missing from place-based approaches at the moment, around what does the future look like for these places, and will it look different? And maybe that's okay. If place is always in progress, and if places are always changing over time, and we recognize that people have life cycles, why wouldn't places have life cycles where they may naturally come to an end? Definitely not a question, I think, that inspires a lot of hope, but definitely one that I think is worth looking at. So now what? Left you with a lot of kind of thoughts around things and opportunities that I think are ways into these kinds of conversations, and I really don't have a whole lot of answers for you, other than this idea of trying to wrestle with an applied sense of place and policy that I'm not quite sure that we're there yet. I think we have a lot of great projects and programs, and we have some policy attempts that use place in a particular way, but there's certainly not a lot of consistency across that. And sometimes we mean communities, and sometimes we mean territories, and sometimes we mean neither or something in the middle. And so the first step may be to really wrestle with this idea around place being more than space, being more than geography, and containing more complex stories. And then the next being around thinking around the ways of whether policy is the actual instrument for place, and if not, what is the alternative, and how do we leverage that for thinking differently about rural futures. I think a lot of my questions as I'm going forward into my PhD dissertation are surrounding these ideas of future scenarios planning, and who gets to have a say in shaping what that future looks like. And place is a really interesting lens for looking at that, because it contains all of these wrestling, intermingling, conflicting ideas around who belongs, around whose story comes to the surface, around whose future are we talking about. And as we head into sort of a period of crisis, I think, where if our work isn't addressing what the climate, what the changing climate, what changing demography, what all of these sort of massive shifts that really and truly do affect our futures in a global scale, and we're ignoring the way that those play out at the local scale, usually because we just don't know how they're going to play out. We need to be asking deeper questions of the people that live in rural places around how they see themselves as part of those hyper-local, globally connected communities. Moving forward, I'm really hoping to take some of this wrestling and some of these questions, and hopefully some of the great feedback from folks that are on this call today, to really start tangling with this idea around how do we apply this, what does this look like. And I know that a couple folks that are participating have already sent me emails previously about asking around, now what do we do with this? And my question is to sort of turn that back on the folks attending the call, is what would this mean for your work? What does this mean around taking something forward, and how do we leverage a more nuanced understanding of place into policy? And is that even possible, is the next question. Is that something that our current institutional frameworks are set up to deal with? So I'm just leaving you with a whole bunch of questions based on the messy contents of my brain as I've been wrestling with these things. And I'd certainly, I guess, open it up now to hopefully some good questions from folks on the floor. If you find yourself either wishing that I had more answers for you and now disengaged, or wanting to talk more in either direction, you can find me at a number of these places after the webinar. Again, my Twitter handle is just my name. There's some information about work I'm working on at the Rural Dev at Libre Professorship website. I work under Dr. Ryan Gibson on my PhD, and then my email address is there as well. So I look forward to hopefully some good comments and questions from everybody on the call. I'll turn that over to Munzaline to help me moderate.
Thank you, Ashley, for this great presentation. Just a quick friendly reminder, any questions that any of you guys have in the audience, please put them in the Q&A box down below, and then Ashley will be happy to answer them.
Some are very close to urban while some are distant. What differences? Okay, so some rural communities are very close to urban while some are distant. What different challenges do you see? So in terms of proximity to urban areas, I think that this idea of remoteness or distance is contextual for one thing. So I used to joke, I think, prior to having driven a lot through rural Scotland, that there was no such thing as somewhere remote in Europe. There was just no way that it could possibly be remote, because I'm used to a Canadian context where the scale of the country feels so much larger. However, my experience over the last couple of months has been that I could be 50 miles down the road and it would feel just as remote as if I had been driving for 5 hours at home in Ontario. And in terms of that distance to urban, I think that plays into some of those conversations. So what is your experience around whether it's a half-hour train commute or whether it's a 2-hour car drive? What that level of distance, I think, is more contextual than it is just purely kilometers on the road. The other part of that is some of the spillovers of agglomeration. So the experience of being able to access urban services actually may come at a risk to some of those rural areas. If it's more convenient for you to drive into an urban area to buy your groceries or deliver your mail or to access other services than it is to support businesses in your own community, or if you can't get those services in your rural community, then it creates this kind of vicious cycle downwards, right? And that's where a lot of the place-based approaches come from, is this combating of those vicious cycles. Alternatively, we see all these great stories, both anecdotally and in research, of when there is sometimes a degree of remoteness, depending on the identity of that place and the people within that place. If you're just over that hump of whatever is considered far enough away from an urban environment and you want to see something happen, then you have to build it yourself. And so there's some great examples. I'm thinking of some interesting things that have come out of Owen Sound, which is a small urban environment in Bruce County, or even the Western Isles here in Scotland, around people that have identified a need and decided that they were going to start everything from a window cleaning business to a car hire to an event space to a cheese shop, or those kinds of things, because they decided that they wanted to have that in their community. Because it was just too much distance to overcome to get it somewhere else. So I think it's a bit of a double-edged sword, where it might be seen as a benefit to be close to urban environments, when in reality, it may make us more prone to overlook the assets that are in our own environment. Will the slide deck be posted on the Rural Dev website? It will be posted on the RPLC website as part of the webinars, and sure, absolutely, I'll post it up on there as well. There's a list of articles at the end of things that have kind of been mulling about in my brain and that are related to this, to the presentations at the end, that are all hyperlinked as well, so you can take a look at some of the conflicting ideas that have happened here. So from Kyle of CSUE, Kyle Rich asks, I really appreciate the discussion of thinking forward and not always about heritage centers over schools, and I think it works in several ways. I'm wondering what your thoughts on rural areas being gentrified, for lack of a better word, by spillover tourism from cities. I'm thinking about some of the smaller municipalities in or around Muskoka, where once tourists are retiring with a vision of the future that involves keeping places small and under-resourced. How do we mitigate who gets a say in diverse views of the future? Big question, sorry. Thanks for the softball, Kyle. So I think that it's a really important question. And I think as we've seen tourism become the thing that's been marketed, I think, to a lot of rural communities as a way forward out of economic challenges, what that's encouraging is a lot of the issues that come with marketing a place for consumption. So as a place becomes consumable, as it becomes a consumable good, it has consequences in a lot of the ways you're speaking about. And so you have a couple tensions, I think, that are apparent in your question. And one of those is the challenge of having absentee residents, so people that are occupying maybe space within a community but are not there full time. And so then you have sort of holiday homes and those things. And in some places, the expectations that come with those people that are quite often maybe coming from an urban environment and expecting the same level of services in the small community that they're going to, despite not being there year round, and seeing the other side of the cost of maintaining those services. I think this idea around gentrification is such an interesting question as well, because it kind of goes hand in hand with that previous question around the consumption of place, where, you know, everyone wants to have, I think in Ontario, everywhere was doing trails for a while. I think there was like there's the Cottontail Trail around where I am, which is really just about bunnies, I think. And there's the Butter Tart Trail and the Apple Pie Trail and all these great things. But it became kind of everyone was going to have their own trail. So then as you're promoting place as a consumable good, it then muddies the water a bit and they all become the same. The other bit around trying to keep places small and under-resourced, I think, is really, really important as a question around the future, right? So is this something that we want to maintain rural places and rural spaces as a retreat in one way for kind of people to leave and escape their urban environments? Are they meant to be productivist? Are they meant to be purely a place where our food and energy comes from? Increasing conversations around rural areas being carbon sinks. And so are they going to be just the place where we mitigate our guilt over our energy consumption and around our carbon footprint? And is that going to be the future of rural places? Well, recognizing that these places need those resources to continue if they're going to continue to be something interesting. And I think that question around who gets a say in diverse views of the future really points to the need for different processes other than primarily right now, property taxes and municipal elections are the way in which we decide who gets a say over what that future looks like, rather than questions around what does the future of a place feel like and look like? I don't really have an answer around those ways for mitigating it, other than we need to ask those questions more around who benefits from keeping somewhere small, if that keeping it small means that it's under-resourced. Can you be small and actually adequately resourced? I think you can. So I sort of turn that back to say that this is a really useful question for asking people that are in positions of decision-making power around how they're wrestling with those questions and how that process works, so that we're being very clear on who's developing that vision. I said earlier, this idea of transparency in the future scenarios planning being very important is that we need to be surfacing that question around who's making those decisions and how they're made. And is there a conscious decision-making process actually happening? I think maybe further to that point is that these things kind of happen a little bit less on purpose than we might think. And so how do we use a policy process, or how do we use the tools at our disposal to interrupt that kind of stumbling into the future to determine how we get there on purpose? I hope I came even close to that, Cal. That was a big one, and we'll have to have a conversation about that later because I think it's really important. So from Bridget, so do you think climate change will motivate more place-based planning and policy? I think it can. I think it has to. I think the interesting part will be in what way. So as I mentioned, I think in part of my response to Kyle, my meandering response to Kyle's big question was, is whether where and how we see rural places in this place-based approach to climate change and responses to that is very intriguing to me. So they tend to be now places where we're looking to as test beds for renewable energy, and that's good and bad. I'm not so sure I ever agreed to be part of an experiment, and I kind of balk at that idea of rural places being living labs around what renewables or what different alternatives for energy might look like. But there are also certainly places that can be leveraged as an opportunity for becoming future-oriented and for thinking about different ways of conceptualizing rural places. I think we'll have to wrestle with the idea that climate change means rural places are going to look different. They're going to be different. Certainly if we talk about some of the islands that are considered sort of rural or remote, there will come a time where they may disappear altogether, or they're eroding at a rate where we have to look at whether they're sustainable to keep people in those places as the climate shifts. And we're looking at, I'm thinking of things like northern Scandinavia, where the possibility for growing crops further and further north. Some people look at that as an opportunity. I mean, maybe a rather short-lived opportunity, but it is an opportunity nonetheless. So as the actual experience of the environment in a place, because our relationship to places is spatially oriented in a lot of ways and related to the landscape, as that shifts and changes, we'll have to wrestle with whether we can continue to live in tornado belts or on fault lines or in the path of more and more wildfires. And as we have climate refugees or the lack of water and certain places become uninhabitable, it will mean things for the places that remain habitable. And I think we have to plan for that in terms of our policy responses. We're asking the big questions, and I love it. This is great. I think we got a few more minutes if there's any more kicking around. Again, I'm not a climate scientist or anything that I come from, but I think that a lot of these questions really wrestle with the idea around how do we use place as something that's changeable and transitive over time. Roddy, is rural always a good adjective? I find rural economic development sometimes constrains opportunity. Is it just economic development in a rural area? I love it. This is why I've gotten to be so interested in these ideas of place responsive policy or place-based policy, is that if we had truly place responsive policy or place-based approaches to economic development or any of those kinds of things, then we could apply them in all kinds of places, right? So it's not just urban or rural. It becomes something that responds to any number of those things, however you want to find your boundary around those places. I think that rural, we wear it like a badge of honor and also like a pejorative in both ways sometimes, in terms of that it gets used as a way, as sometimes literally shorthand for underdeveloped areas or for places that are just simply not urban. And we also struggle with this notion of a lot of the current place-making policy and a lot of the approaches that go certainly towards innovation or to economic development. And those orientations come from a very urban context. They're developed in an urban application. They're meant to be evaluated against urban metrics. And so the question becomes, are we measuring rural programs or rural policy interventions against urban standards that were never really meant to apply? And so this is where this idea around place comes into play, that if we can have responses that are open to the specific context of any given place, that's a tall order, but I think that would help us do away with some of those issues. Richard, is the distinction really rural versus urban, or is it metropolis versus everywhere else, i.e. are small towns rural? That's an excellent question. I think that that really depends on, I hate to go back to context as everything, but it really is, I think, to me in this question, is that sometimes if we get down into these divides then, and again, speaking to the very beginning of this, these divisions that are based on sometimes rather arbitrary distinctions, get us into some trouble. So one person's metropolis might be 20,000 people, while another person's metropolis wouldn't be anything smaller than Berlin. So I think that the idea of what counts as urban or what counts as a metropolis versus everywhere else is tricky as well. And so this idea of trying to find diverse archetypes or diverse notions of place, that there, just like there is not one urban, there is not one rural, and there are different types of everywhere else, and there are different types of metropolises, is maybe more the direction to go than finding these other classifications, and to avoid some of that issue around, well, that city isn't really a city, or that rural isn't really rural. It's like, well, that is a place onto itself. That place is this particular place. So for me, that's where place-based approaches actually give you an opportunity into getting away from some of that. I struggle with the idea of boundaries and really like the idea of having multiple descriptors that recognize complexity. Identity, spatial realities, and context is a good trinity to use as descriptors, but policies are usually written for more simplicity, saying something black and white, and then allowing for local decision making to wiggle out of the black and white. Absolutely. This is the key challenge around place-based approaches, where so much of what so how do you get then a policy to address that complexity? I think that goes back to these notions of appropriate scale. So I think some of this comes down to trying to find ways to decide at what scale do certain policies need to be implemented. And I think some of the wriggling out of that black and white descriptor that you provide there happens when a policy is asking people at the wrong scale to implement something that may or may not be appropriate. So if you are having to compete, so for one meeting, I have a particular bee in my bonnet sometimes about things like the competitive funding for infrastructure, for things around smart cities and those kinds of things, is that I think that we have to find ways where communities don't have to pit themselves against each other to get funding for important infrastructure. But if it's framed that way, then you have to take everything that's happening in your community and make it fit within the policy instrument rather than the other way around. And so I think some of that, getting a policy to address complexity, comes from really starting with the question of what are we trying to do? What's the purpose of the policy? And what's the actual intent and the goal of what we're up to here? And if we kind of go back to, it sounds kind of silly to say that sort of simply, but if we go right back to the purpose of what's intended by a policy approach, you can start to interrogate some of the goals and the embedded assumptions that are baked within that say, well, we're putting this policy forward in very black and white terms because that's how we understand the situation, rather than what is the actual objective and what tools will help us meet that objective. And it may not be a policy at all. It may be some other form of investment. It may be some other program. It may be a simple case. It may be a case of simply asking people what they want. And so I think if we go back then to that idea of what is the goal of the thing that we're doing, that teases out a lot more complexity in the framing than when we're a policy in search of an application rather than an application looking for a tool to support it. So from Richard, we say former Prime Minister Harper divided the issue among somewheres, meaning people who identify by place, and anywheres who can live and function globally. I don't know. I think we all belong to somewhere. We all call somewhere home. And to a large extent, some of the divisions that I see, I interpret in this idea around people feeling competing feelings about what home means and who gets to claim space in my home. So whether we love or hated that home, or whether we attach to a place for any particular reason, I think we all choose to live somewhere in particular. We're embodied beings. So in a lot of ways, this comes from Doreen Massey is a critical feminist geographer. I come from a critical feminist perspective myself, is that we live in the world in real human bodies. So you can't kind of disassociate into sort of some collection of bits and bytes that hang out in the ether. You may have a virtual presence, but we are physically embodied things, and so therefore we're attached to physicality. Sometimes that attachment in terms of people who are identifying by place is your home. Sometimes that's where you come from. Sometimes that's where you've chosen that you want to be. Sometimes it's in direct opposition to that attachment to place, in that I belong to this place even though I don't want to, or I hate it, or I want to be somewhere else desperately. But all of those are place attachment, and they form a critical part of our identity. So that's a long roundabout saying of my thoughts are that I disagree that you can kind of be anywheres that live and function globally. I think you can participate globally, and that you can be part of these globalized networks. But the way we orient ourselves in the world is still very much about our relationship to the space around us. These are excellent questions. I'm just loving this so much. This is great.
I believe these are all our questions. Ashley, do you have anything to add?
Just to thank everyone for joining me on a sort of complex and sort of tangled bit of conversation. It's something that I think we will all continue to struggle with throughout our careers. I don't necessarily think there is an answer or a bridge that will solve all of these things, but that I appreciate the space from the RPLC and from everyone that participated this afternoon to ask these questions and to tease them out and to really push things forward so that we keep surfacing them. I think that sometimes we're all very busy and dedicated to getting the work done, that taking the time to kind of pause and think, well, you know, like, are we really sure we know what we're talking about here, and how do we do this in a meaningful and accountable and sort of forward-thinking way. So thank you to the RPLC. Thank you to everyone that took the hour out of their afternoon to participate. And thank you so much for the excellent questions. And I sure hope that everyone keeps in touch and continues the conversation as we go forward together.
Okay, I would like to once again thank you, Ashley, for your great presentation. And I would also like to thank the audience for attending this webinar and for their participation as well. Have a great rest of the day, everybody, and thank you for participating.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Mandaline.
Thanks. Bye.